Scott, you've spent years in the career, in the passion that you liked in service of Australia. Then you decided to transition into, let's call it civilian life. What does that transition look like?
I think it looks different for everyone. And my experience is unique, and as is everyone's. But I think there are some probably core elements that are quite similar for a lot of people. So for me, the transition was quite abrupt, and so what I mean by that is a lot of people when they get out of the military, they get out of the military, but maybe they transition into something that is similar or working with similar people to what they were doing before. So a lot of people take the transition for them is a transition, i.e. it's not abrupt. And so it's a transition from being in the military to maybe they're kind of almost, in some people's cases, they kind of get out and they're now almost doing something very similar to what they were doing when they're in the military, maybe even contracting back to the military or something like that, but now they're no longer in uniform. So that's what I would call like a kind of more of a soft transition where they're kind of stepping out of the military in the day-to-day sense, but they haven't stepped away too far from the people that they're used to working with. Maybe they haven't moved geographically from where they were previously, and they're working in a similar field or doing a similar job to what they were doing. So that's kind of the softer type of transition, and then I guess it gets increasingly kind of harder or more abrupt if you want, the further that you move away from the military. So I think a lot of people, my experience from just looking at my kind of cohort of people that I, joined the military with and so forth, and most people that I see, they do that kind of softer style transition where they get out, but they're still either working back to something that's in the military, working in defense industry, or surrounded by a bunch of people that are kind of ex-military or what have you. I felt like I did something that was a little bit more abrupt, if you want to call it that, where I was doing something that, in terms of joining the public service and working with a bunch of people that weren't ex-military, wasn't necessarily specifically, he was still working in government, but wasn't, necessarily kind of as closely kind of tied to defense. And so I felt like, I probably cut that umbilical cord, quite quickly, in that sense. But, I was still in Canberra, and I was still kind of, in that government environment, whereas some people then make a much harder transition again, where they abruptly go and, pick up a job overseas doing something kind of completely unrelated. But, if I was to characterize most people, they do something that is still in somehow connected, for a lot of maybe, army infantry types, they might go and get a security job or something where they still feel like they're kind of doing something similar to what they were doing. I think that it's kind of natural that people kind of fall to something that they're kind of closer to, and that's not a criticism of anyone's transition as such. It's just a broad reflection of how I see a lot of it kind of happening, that people don't necessarily jump too far away. I think the further you jump, though, the harder it kind of can be. And so I think that's when, we talk about people that kind of struggle with a transition or that have more difficulty. I think especially if you've been in the military for quite a period of time, you're used to always being around people that that you're working with people that have been through the same experiences, same kind of training. You're all talking a common language. You don't have to sit there and explain things. If I say I've done XYZ course, someone automatically and knows exactly what that means. They know what, by extension, a bunch of things that flow from that. Whereas if I say that to somebody else, I've now got to spend half an hour kind of explaining what that is, and there's a whole bunch of assumptions you just don't have to go through. So I think the further you move away from that, the further you're moving away from a support network, the further you're moving away from the kind of network of people that already know that stuff. So I think the more of that hard jump you make, the harder it can kind of be for you, because you are stepping now into a very foreign, work environment, culture, and with no kind of support network kind of around you. And so I think the further you kind of move, so that softer transition is probably easier, but it's less of and therefore it's less of a transition.
I'll tell you why I asked the question. I grew up in Sri Lanka. There was a civil war for 30 years. My friends who, joined active service, who, not part of it after that, when we speak, they speak about, hey, look, I'm doing something really meaningful. I'm really enjoying life after the military. I'm surrounded by lots of people, but I feel lonely. And when I unpack that, or when I chat with the people that are closest to me, it's what you touched on, to say, yeah, there are people around me, but I don't know if that camaraderie exists. I don't know if that common, even simple things like the common language set exist. And growing up in Sri Lanka, there's not a lot of support there for somebody who wants to at least have a conversation about things like that. Now it gets a little more trickier for somebody who's been in active combat for a decade and then has to transition into civilian life, because your mindset, I hear, is very different. What type of supports are available for somebody that's transitioning from active service to civilian life?
I think it's certainly changed, certainly from when I did it, because I mean, I got out, a fair while ago now. So at the time, there was you did what they called it, like a transition seminar or kind of thing, which was basically, you went to a conference for a couple of days, and you have someone from MSBS, or what is now your Commonwealth kind of super corporation, kind of turn up and tell you what arrangements happened with your super, and then someone will tell you about, well, this is now you're going to have to go and get a Medicare card because you have free everything's kind of provided for. This is how kind of Medicare works, and then this is how a bunch of things work. That so it was very what I would call largely kind of administrative, and then there was a session on, well, this is how you write a CV, and this is what and things like that. So whereas, as I understand it, a lot of the transition seminar stuff now is a lot more about some of the other kind of support network stuff that's available, whether it be from Veterans Affairs through to other ex-service organisations and things like that. So my understanding is that whole kind of transition experience these days is a lot more kind of supported than it probably was. Certainly when I did it, but equally by some accounts, there's probably still some room for improvement there. But I think by and large, the kind of the support networks that DVA and others kind of have in place, as I understand it these days, is probably better than it was back then. But you still sometimes you don't know what you don't know either, and so I think even my own experience, DVA is probably only even recently that I've learned that DVA offered some services that probably would have been handy for me to know that existed, previously and things like that. So, I think there's, like a lot of things in life, there's a lot of things that are out there, but if you don't know they're out there, you don't know that you can kind of access them or not. But it's certainly probably changed a little bit from when I did it, probably for the better.
And what's the role family has played, Scott, in helping you understand yourself better as you live in civilian society, as you start a business, as you mature?
Look, I think family plays an important role no matter kind of where you are on your journey. I think a lot of people probably outside the military don't understand what a lot of what I would say military families go through. And what I mean by that is, when you're in the military, you're often posted quite regularly. I mean, friends of mine who are up to, 25th posting or whatever the case may be, you're never in a place very long. And the family, the partner or the family kind of more broadly is making a lot of sacrifices in order to support the activity of who it is who's in the military, or sometimes it might be husband and wife because maybe they both met when they're in the military or whatever the case may be. So I think from a transition perspective, you talk about what's the kind of role of the family. I also think that what we kind of miss in some of the narrative is the sacrifice or that the family has made in order to support the person that's been in the military. Extended deployments at a time, a lot of moves, mum or dad, whoever the member is, being away a lot. So I think also for them, there's a transition for them from having, mum or dad or whatever the case may be, deployed for extended periods of time, especially, more recently in terms of global war on terror and things like that, where people were deployed a lot and for extended periods. There's a period of transition, I think, for the family as well. So obviously, I think people think about, what's the family got to do to kind of support the transition of the member, but it's also, that the kids and the partner that are involved in them probably returning to a bit more of normality or a little bit more kind of less tension as well. Dad's away, is he going to come back, like, and some of the uncertainty that exists there, or just the lack of comms, mum being left, or, dad being left, depending upon, who it is, being left to kind of run the house. And they've kind of got their own kind of systems and structures in place. And then suddenly kind of dad or mum comes back and then they want things run differently. And so, well, hang on, everything's been running fine while you've been away. So, I think it's very easy for us to just focus on the member who is transitioning, whereas I would argue that, and I think there's greater recognition, certainly in military circles now than there has been, but, to a broader society perspective is recognition that, the families are transitioning too, and that there's, support that they probably need, including while, people are still in. So I think, that's probably a forgotten or sometimes overlooked aspect that families have had to give up. Often the partner has had to forgo or sacrifice their own career in order for the member to kind of pursue theirs. And then sometimes it's like, okay, the member might be getting out of the military and like, okay, well, now it's my partner's time to kind of pursue what they want to pursue. So how do we make sure that, we support that family to now, let the other partner kind of go and pursue their career or what they want to do, or how does that work? So there can be quite a bit of kind of change and not turmoil, but quite a bit of kind of change and pressure on families too when someone kind of transitions. And then, equally, if, that the member is transitioning and doing what I would call more of a hard transition where, they're going through quite a challenging time to try and adjust to a new and different environment. And the family is too, because what they're used to in terms of what mum or dad normally kind of goes and does is quite different. And so, I guess my point is that we need to kind of consider the transition the family is kind of going through as well. Yeah.